Hello everyone and welcome. Today we will look a very interesting game, instructive game between GM Gleb Dudin and Fabiano Caruana. This game doesn't involve any flashy sacrifices, but we'll see Caruana play solidly and with precision, and we'll see how he can beat a GM with precision and the solidity of his moves. So let's start the game. Is a Queen's Gambit declined? Caruana doesn't go for Nimzo Indian and chooses very solid line. Black is very solid, has a strong point on d5 and just looks to castle and develop without creating much weaknesses. So h6, black would like for white to take the knight and so he can capture with the other knight. Downside of black's position is that the pieces are in each other's way, so he would like nothing more than white to take on f6. Plays bishop h4, bishop e7, queen c2. So white develops the queen to c2, controls the e4 square, and most likely the c file will be opened. The queen at c2 is in a good position, and before developing bishop d3, he postpones it for the time being, so to avoid losing a tempo by d takes c4. Castles. Now before developing the bishop, he exchanges on d5, creates a temporary weakness on c7, and develops the bishop. Black improves the pawn structure on the queen side, looks forward to continue his development. Of course, white will try to create a weakness later. White plays knight e2 and not knight f3, although both are playable. The purpose of knight e2 is that in the future, this d5 square or d5 pawn will be weak. The knight on e2 can jump to f4 and pressure the d5 square. e8, a4. White tries to start play on the queen side. He wants to create some weaknesses, either on c6 or d5. Or even b7 and attack that point. Currently black doesn't have any weakness on the queen side, but with marching of the pawns forward for white, he will create a weakness sooner or later. So white will play on the queen side and the center, but one of the problems for black is that his pieces are getting in each other's way, so he wants to exchange some pieces to have more room to maneuver. So knight e4. This leads to exchange of two minor pieces, and now black has more space in his camp. He has only two minor pieces. He can maneuver his pieces and move his pieces in a more comfortable way. He has a strong point on e4, which gives him an extra space in the center. So he will play in the center and on the king side. d5 square is very important for both teams, so both will try to have control on the d5 square. There's tension on the d5. There's always a question in there that white can push d5 or black can push c5 if necessary. So this is a very sensitive point, the c5 and the d5 squares, especially d5. White continues his queenside play to try to create some weaknesses on the queen side. White has more space on the queen side, so he will try to create a weakness on the queen side and attack it. Caruana plays knight f6. It is worth noting that of course, knight f6 is not a mistake, but there's also the option of pawn f5. The advantage of pawn f5 is that you don't need to babysit the e4 pawn the whole game, so your pieces can move freely and better as they want. But the downside is that this bishop will temporarily be hemmed in. You won't have this diagonal to attack the king side. But of course, that's temporary. I mean, you can always sacrifice the f pawn with f4 at the right moment, and this will give you great foothold in the center. You don't have to babysit the e4 pawn, and your pieces can move freely. But of course, the move played by Caruana, knight f6, is also good. It keeps the bishop diagonal open and assists in a way the king side attack. So white castles f5. As you can see, some extra defenders for the e4 pawn. Not forget the knight also can move to g3, increase the pressure on the e4 pawn, and you don't want to lose that. So the bishop is well placed here. Queen a4. So white here seemingly has two threats in a way: to push a6 to weaken c6, which the queen is attacking, and also another move which we will see. So Caruana plays classical chess, just centralizes all his pieces, controls all the key squares, controls e4, and is preparing even for a kingside play. Now white plays queen a3 to exchange queens, which is a very good move. If plays a6, black can simply play b5, and there is no en passant. Queen c2, rook c8, and the c6 pawn, although a backward pawn, but it is not difficult to protect it. Black can protect the c pawn and advance his kingside play. So white goes for queen a3, doesn't push a6, and it makes sense to exchange queens for white because black will play on the king side. So exchanging queens will lessen the effect of any kingside attack. White will be free to play his queenside play without worrying about his king getting checkmated. So Caruana avoids the queen exchange, plays a6. This is the first inaccuracy or even the mistake of the game. You don't want to play a6. Just because you can push the pawn doesn't mean you have to push the pawn. It's like checking. Sometimes amateurs, when they see a check they can do to the king, they just do it. Well, just because you can doesn't mean you should. I will tell you why this is not a good move. Because playing a6 allows Caruana to play b6 and close and even improve his queenside pawn structure. Before playing b6, Caruana had a less flexible queenside pawn structure. After b6, he has control of the dark squares, especially c5 for the time being. So, and the a6 pawn even can become weak. So by pushing a6, white made his a pawn weak and improved the queenside pawn structure for black. Now black has good control of many squares. You might say, well, the c6 pawn is can become weak, but it's not difficult to defend the c6 pawn. I mean, you can play rook c8 and defend it. a4, of course, it's not even threatening c6 because the queen is defending it. So Caruana starts his kingside play, and there's a difference between both sides because even if white succeeds, let's say on the queen side, might win a pawn, but if black succeeds on the king side, it would checkmate the king. So in a way, black's attack can be more dangerous than targeting the c6, but the c6 can always be protected by a rook c8, for example, even if needed. It might not even be needed. It was better to play rook to d1 so that you can push d5. The rook will be well placed on d1 when you push d5. You should counter in the middle with white. And the game would continue h4, d5, and c5. This is of course a sample line. As you can see, the rook on d1 is well placed to support the d pawn. So playing the rook c1 to attack the c6 pawn is meaningless because he can always push c5, he can play rook c8, there's multiple ways. h4, Caruana is not worried because rook c1 is an inaccuracy, it wastes time. So now that the attack is advancing for black, of course do not underestimate the attack. Once lines open up on the king side, once weaknesses are created, the pieces for black, the queen, the knight, the bishop, supported by the e-pawn, can create very dangerous attack. He's being attacked by the flank. He tries to place something in the center. c5. Now chance to exchange queens, but Caruana knows what he's doing in the sense that his king side play forcing white to make concessions in the center and on the queen side by playing, especially when white played inaccurate moves. So by playing inaccurate moves, he was forced to give concessions to stop black's play on the king side. Black can now easily target in the future the d pawn and the a pawn. Doesn't even have to mate because once weaknesses are created, he can switch plans according to circumstances. So white plays rook d1, which he should have played, loses a tempo. Black continues the attack, h3. Now the difference between the a6 push move and the h3 push move, white cannot safely play for now g3 like black played b6, because the difference is that on the king side there is the king sitting here. So by playing g3, creating white square weaknesses, even more dangerous. It's dangerous for white because the king resides there. This is a very important moment. The attack has arrived. Should exchange queens here. The attack has arrived for black. You don't want queens on the board. But white plays the mistake, rook d2, to give strength to the d pawn. So Caruana doesn't give white a second chance and moves the queen out of the way and even closer to the king side. Knight g3, bishop d7. The bishop retreats with a tempo, queen c4. As you can see, there are now many weaknesses. With the queens still on the board, the king side is weak for white. The d pawn can become weak and the a pawn, three weaknesses. So it's no wonder that white's position will soon crumble. Queen e5, queen takes a better square. The dark squares controls the dark squares. Imagine just the knight being on g4 and the queen, let's say, being on h4 or even h6. The attack will be too strong. So white has to play in the center and immediately to stop any flank attack from developing, because it is getting serious. If given the chance, black can play, for example, queen g5 in the future at opportune moment, and h4, when knight with jumping to g4 will create great pressure on h2. So an attack can develop if white is not careful. So a play in the center is necessary, which white does, tries to create play in the middle. So white plays d5, exchanges. Caruana knows that he doesn't even need to mate. He can exchange these pieces. He doesn't need to go for a checkmate, because in trying to stop the checkmate, white created two weaknesses, two pawns, two weaknesses, which will give him enough play to, if he wins these two pawns, for example, targets these two pawns, he will create enough play without any risk to win the game. So the correct move is to take with the queen, of course, and d6 pawn will fall, the a6 pawn most likely will fall, only a matter of time. But instead, white, under the pressure, takes with the rook, which makes black's job easier. The b2 pawn falls, the rook goes to d1 and b5. Here white resigns. Why? Because the only move is to the queen to move to c1, which will then exchange queens, and the bishop will win the pawn. For example, queen goes to c1, takes, and even the d6 pawn will fall very soon. So there is no point continuing. So we can see that the way Caruana created pressure on the king side assisted with White's inaccuracies. White was forced to play moves which even weakened its position more, which created new weaknesses, and Caruana didn't even have to play for mate. He just capitalized on the weaknesses created by White's inaccuracies, and without doing any flashy moves, any sacrifices, or even any violent mating attack, just has a one endgame. He will be 2 pawns up, and nothing White can do about that.